Hi, again, Captain Peter Cutsey with the briefing on the onboard performance tool, commonly known as the OPT. This is something that you've taken in ground school. However, once you're on the flight deck and you open up the iPad, the first thing you're prompted with is the tail number. So that has to be checked against the flight plan to make sure that you are using the correct data for the aircraft that you're in on that particular flight. The user guide is a very good document, 25 pages approximately, with pictures and procedures and explanations on how the OPT works. Even though you've taken it in ground school, it's a good review to have, and I strongly suggest you look at it. And as I mentioned, here's the first page that you'll be looking at when you power it up. So once you verify that you have the correct data, then you can start using it. You normally would fit this in after the pre-flight checklist has been complete. That is the preliminary pre-flight, the CDU pre-flight, both the captain and the first officer's pre-flight procedures have been completed. Shoulder harnesses, seat belts, and rudder pedals adjusted. That is the trigger to begin the first stage of the OPT, which you can do now. And when the final figures come, you can complete it. So make sure you follow your company's SOPs regarding when you're going to actually do it. We're going to do it in 2 steps, and I think it makes sense that when the pre-flights are complete, you get into initially setting it up. So the first thing you do is ensure you've got the correct tail number, and both pilots, of course, are checking this against their copies of the flight plan. Once that is done and both members have copied the ATIS individually, pilots normally copy the ATIS when they get into their seat so that they have a good idea of the runway, and of course they have an altimeter setting for their pre-flight check, which is important, and a temperature which is required. So follow your SOPs on that, but that works well for me. The captain actually initiates by saying ready for the greens, and the first officer says go ahead, and the captain will state the initial data conditions that are to be used for the initial data entry. Now, unless you know what runway is in use, and unless you've listened to the ATIS, you won't know. That's why copying the ATIS initially is important. So, left seat to right seat, airport, OMDB, first officer, airport, OMDB, confirming that's what the selections you've made on your iPad. Runway 30 left, first officer selects and confirms, runway 30 left. Intersection, full 30 left, first officer, intersection, full 30 left. Conditions dry, conditions dry. Flap optimum, first officer, flap optimum. Air conditioning bleeds on, air conditioning bleeds on. Anti-ice off, anti-ice off. CFG forward limit to start with. CFG forward limit. RTG optimum, RTG optimum. The greens have been done. Now, the information that you copied separately, which is the ATIS, you would enter those, and they're called the whites. There are 3 of them: the wind, and don't apply any gusts, the outside air temperature, and the QNH. Phase 1 has now been completed. So now you can carry on with your the rest of the procedures, such as getting an ATC clearance. And when the final data comes, the load sheet final and the print off, if you have a printer on board your airplane, you have your final figures, then you can actually go ahead and do that. And Once that has been done, after the final weights have been received, takeoff performance calculations, enter the actual takeoff weight, that's both pilots, from the load sheet. After receiving the final load sheet, confirm the actual MAC for takeoff, and select calculate. The calculate light won't come up bright blue with white font unless all the data is inserted. So if you haven't put in the whites, the 3 whites from the ATIS, you won't get a calculate prompt. All right. And once you push it, please wait. And the first officer will record this data. In this particular case, this is what is on the flight plan for this airline, and actually record it, because your flight plan is your final official copy. So this data is important. He or she will copy the data, the rating, takeoff N1, the actual takeoff weight, 72,740 kilos, the minimum flight retraction altitude, 870. And I would recommend at this point to pause and go up to the barrel bug setting and set the barrel bugs to 870 at that point. Don't guess at it first. Wait until you do it. And this is what I suggest. Runway 30 left, flaps 1, V1 159 knots, VR 160 knots, V2 163 knots, VREF 146 knots, stab trim 5.2, nose up, and actual zero fuel weight 51,720 kilos, actual fuel on board 21,260 kilos, and CFG 22.2. All right, that is now recorded on the flight plan, and that's the official document. So that's done. Now, the OPT calculated data, this is what we were talking about the greens, and the way I showed you a few minutes ago. I read from top to bottom for the greens, and there they are there. And the whites are the data from the ATIS. And when you actually entered the actual takeoff weight, which is here, calculate came up in blue, you pushed it, and there's the data you got. And if you notice in the background, there's full, meaning you're using full thrust in this circumstance. If you wanted to check the assumed temperature, if it was allowed, etc., you would push that button. So there's your flaps 1, 870 feet above MSL, 862 really, but it's rounded up to 870, which is the accelerate height. All right, and the runway is runway 30 left, and the takeoff weight is here again, and the thrust selected, and the N1. V1, VR, V2, and VREF 40. So there's your data, and that's what it looks like. And you've recorded it. And now the final loading of the CDU is initiated by the captain, who reads the actual zero fuel weight from the load sheet and directs the first officer to enter it. You follow your SOPs on how your company wants you to actually do this, but this is one way from one airline, and the way they do it, I particularly like, because it makes good sense. So then the first officer enters the actual zero fuel weight, which was left open, incidentally, on the CDU pre-flight. That entry was left open. Now is the first time that you're going to enter it. So you enter the actual zero fuel weight into the init page, and then the first officer calls out the gross weight from the CDU, the top line. Excuse me. Both pilots verify the correct insertion of the actual zero fuel weight and check the actual zero fuel weight with the load sheet. So both pilots are making sure that, even though the captain directs it. Compare the load sheet actual takeoff weight plus the taxi fuel from the flight plan with the CDU gross weight, that is what you're reading on the top line. And if it checks out within limits, whatever limits your company have set, could be 100 kilos, then direct the first officer to execute. In other words, both pilots have checked that, in fact, the figures check. First officer execute on the captain's command. Then the first officer enters the assumed temperature, if applicable, on the N1 page. Then select the appropriate D rate. Captain verifies the assumed temperature, if applicable. The D rate on the upper DU, TMA, and N1 value adjacent to the N1 gauges. And the first officer confirms correct thrust settings. First officer enters the remaining part of the performance data and reading it from the flight plan. He's not reading it from his OPT. The captain is confirming from his OPT that the information he's reading, because the captain doesn't see the flight plan. And it's actually set up that way to make sure that everything has been checked individually and entered properly. Verify the flap setting, the captain now, after the first officer has entered the performance data, trim and V speeds. And then the captain goes up to the MCP, enters the V speed, arms the L throttle, and arms LNAV if needed, and arm VNAV. And we're talking about an FMC 10.8 and up, 10.7 and up. Verify flaps 40 VREF on the approach page. And that would be confirmed, of course, from the flight plan. First officer's flight plan entered data from the OPT. And then the captain will cross-check the flaps 40 VREF from the OPT. So the captain has actually still got his OPT open and cross-checking all the information the first officer is reading from the flight plan, not from his OPT. This way, both pilots are sure that the data has checked and it's correct. Then the first officer sets 250 knots at 10,000 feet plus field elevation on the climb page. You may be at a high altitude airport, and 10,000 feet MSL is not 10,000 feet above the airport. You have to set in 10,000 plus field elevation on the climb page. Final verification of FMC CDU entries against the OPT calculations. So that's a final check. So that is it. Just a quick rundown on the OPT and one way of doing it that really works well to make sure that no one has made any mistakes. Enjoy your flying and see you at the next briefing. And remember, if you need my help or want an online briefing with your partner, call me. All the information is on screen. I'll gladly do it, no charge. I love flying and I love to share my experiences. Thanks.